So we are today with Sarah Abbas from Sudan. I would like you to introduce yourself,
No problem.
please.
I can do this. So my name is Sarah Abbas. I live in Berlin, but I'm actually from Sudan originally. I am a member of an activist group here that was founded at the beginning of the revolution. It's called Sudan Uprising Germany. It's a group of activists, some of them refugee activists from Sudan who basically work to support the revolutionary movement in Sudan. I'm also a political scientist, so this is another way in which I engage with the country.
So can you describe the very hard events that are happening today in Sudan, and what happened 5 months prior the beginning of these events?
Okay, so essentially what has been happening is there has been, I would say a political crisis, but of course we live in crisis. But there has been a crisis since October 2021, which is when the military, the Sudan Armed Forces, and the Rapid Support Forces militia teamed up together to enact a coup d'etat to seize power. At that point, the country was in what was called a transitional period. The transitional period had begun in August of 2019, following the uprising in Sudan, which in Sudan we call the December Revolution, that removed Omar Hassan al-Bashir, the military and head of the country at the time, who had been in power for close to 30 years. Negotiations between civilian forces and between the military at the time resulted in a transitional period of power sharing, essentially, between that institution, the civilians, especially the political parties, as well as the Rapid Support Forces militia. This is a militia that had been made by al-Bashir during his rule following the war in Darfur. It is composed of, it initially was composed of the remnants of the Janjaweed militias that are implicated in the genocide in Darfur following 2002. And they acted initially as border guards, and then al-Bashir kind of promoted them to almost become a rapid response force for him, a flexible way of carrying out the counterinsurgency in different parts of the country. He had wars going in South Kordofan, Nuba Mountains, in Blue Nile, and in Darfur, and eventually kind of nominally affiliated them to the military and brought them also into the capital city in Khartoum as he began to feel a bit less secure in his position. So kind of having access to them gave him power in case of any attempts to overthrow him also by the military. So the RSF and the military are both extensions of the al-Bashir regime, which we call the Salvation regime, the Inqaz regime in Sudan. And they have been pretty much allies and working together. But of course, as the militia grew and prospered and got control of gold mines as well, the military also controls a very large part of the economy. Tensions started to arise between them. These tensions came to a head starting in December. So even though they're power sharing, they weren't able to form a government. They weren't really able to put down the uprising completely. And so they entered negotiations mediated by the UN to come to an agreement, a new agreement that with the idea of restoring kind of democratic transition in Sudan. In December, an agreement was signed, which is called the Framework Agreement, with the mediation of the UN. And since then, there has been a lot of open tension between the RSF and the military. This tension, in part, centers on the question of the integration of the RSF militia into the military, because the call of the revolution has always been that the military returns to the barracks and that the RSF are dissolved. The way in which this dissolution has been thought of by the political actors is by integrating the fighters from the RSF militia into the military. So there was a lot of tension as to whether the RSF would integrate, when it would integrate, what is the timeline, and sort of these kinds of arrangements. This tension is, of course, fomented by external also powers that are backing different parties in this conflict. The RSF is led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who is known as Hemeti in Sudan, and the military is led by General Al-Burhan. On April 15th, the conflict turned violent between the two, and the war started in Marawi first, in the northern part of the country, through the control of the airport there, but also very much in Khartoum, in Darfur, Al Jeneina in West Darfur in particular, Niala in South Darfur, Al Fashir, and sporadically also in Kordofan in Al Gadarif. This has led to a really extremely heartbreaking humanitarian situation at the moment. About 1.1 million people, according to the UN, have been displaced since April 15th, some of them to neighboring countries, to South Sudan, to Chad, to Egypt, to Ethiopia, but most of them displaced within the country itself. A lot of the infrastructure is destroyed in Khartoum and in some of the other cities, including the medical infrastructure and so forth.
So when we talk about the RSF, what can we expect in terms of size?
Well, there's a lot of varying estimates of the size of this militia. I've heard anything from 30,000 to more than 100,000. It's a very large militia that has been growing. It's a very diversified militia. They were also a major component of the troops that fought in Yemen for the Saudi-led coalition on the war there, and they fought alongside the Sudan armed forces there. Actually, Al-Burhan and Hemeti know each other both from there as well as from the war theater in Darfur. So it is an extremely large militia. It has different operations. It acts also as border guards. It's present in multiple parts of the country. It's also been implicated in, at moments, coming to the aid of Haftar in Libya, as well as kind of almost like mercenary soldiers.
Through Minawi.
Through Minawi and through other channels. Haftar right now is also, the media is reporting that is also supplying them with fuel and with weapons and so forth through the Libyan Darfur border. The militia's original area, or the area where it has a very big strength, is Western Sudan, and particularly Darfur, because its leadership comes from the Arab tribes that are in that area.
And do you think that these events' acceleration was expected?
This is a really difficult question. It's always, war always takes you by surprise, and also the size of it takes you by surprise. I think it has been expected in the sense that there has been a growing militarization of the country. And I say this, you have to understand the point from which we are starting. I mean, Sudan is already a country where between 70 to 75%, and that's a conservative estimate, of the GDP is used on defense. And when we say defense, it is mainly used in relation to the counterinsurgency, what they call counterinsurgency wars of the regime. So this has been the case since the early 90s. And initially, of course, it was focused on South Sudan and on fighting the war in South Sudan. And then from the 2000s onwards, it was mainly focused on Darfur, but also Kordofan, South Kordofan, Nuba Mountains, and Blue Nile. The RSF eventually was involved in this, but was also used alongside the military intelligence, and alongside other entities in also putting down protests. So there's a high protester death in the last 4 years during this uprising. And actually, it's not the first time. In 2013, there was also an uprising where, in a very short period of time, more than 200 protesters were killed. And so it's expected in the sense that if you follow the reports on the level and the presence of arms within the country, you could see that it was an unsustainable situation. This, in addition to the growth of what is essentially a parallel force to the military, was sure to come to a head at one point. So as long as those two kind of had a similar agenda, it could somehow continue without open conflict. But this would not have lasted because they both have very big economic interests. They have client states that they also are connected and work for. But in addition to this, they are also becoming very competitive in the political sphere because the RSF's leadership Hamidti also has political ambitions. And so over the last 5 months, he has been kind of breaking away from the military position and going along more with the FFC, the Forces for Freedom and Change, which is the civilian coalition that was negotiating on behalf of a kind of civilian government and so forth. So this is kind of the landscape, and a lot of the weapons, unfortunately, are also in the hands of various ethnic and tribal groupings in the country, because this was one of the policies of the al-Bashir regime, was to arm particularly what in Sudan, and I put this between quotes, Arab tribes in certain parts of the country, including Darfur, as a way of kind of fighting by proxy in these regions.
So since day one of the start of the conflict, we have seen, we had a sense of the presence of foreign interests in Sudan through the seizure of the Marawi airport with a number of Egyptian fighter aircraft, also Egyptian special forces. We have seen a lot of equipments coming from the Emiratis, which are between the hands of both sides, actually. So what is the international, I mean, to say, how to put it clearly, what is the international implication? Who is behind who?
Okay. So again, the regime of al-Bashir excelled at doing something actually which is very difficult to do, which is to kind of become a client of several different entities, particularly in the region, sometimes that don't actually get along with each other, but share the fact that al-Bashir is a client of theirs. So yes, Egypt is a very important player in Sudan and has been since before independence. Sudan was an Egyptian-British condominium. It wasn't just ruled by Britain; it was also jointly ruled by Britain and Egypt. And Egypt has always almost uninterrupted had military regimes in power that prefer to deal with sort of their little brother in Sudan, which is the Sudanese military. And so al-Burhan is known to be quite close to the Egyptian regime, to al-Sisi in particular. And this is still the case today. I mean, this is Egypt has. It's hard to kind of overestimate how important strategically Sudan is for Egypt, both in relation to the Nile waters, because this is a major kind of geostrategic issue for Egypt, in relation to Halaib, which is the sort of disputed area on the border northeast on the Red Sea, and also in relation generally to its own national security, or how it sees as its national security in relation to Sudan. So Egypt is definitely, I would say, has not played a positive role at all in relation to Sudan, and if anything has encouraged the continuation of military rule in the country, very much on the side in this conflict of the military, as opposed to the RSF. The Gulf countries are also very much in Sudan. They're in Sudan because they have very big commercial and land interests in Sudan. There's a lot of what I would call land grabbing deals that exist with the Gulf countries, who have obviously issues with agricultural land, which Sudan has plenty of. They also have interests in terms of, as what happened with the Yemen war, having kind of this ready-made ground troops that can be called upon to fight their wars.
Cannon fodders, basically.
Cannon fodders, because, you know, in the war in Yemen, it was really mostly, I mean, the Sudanese made up the biggest component of the ground troops, and the Saudis were not on the ground, right? They were using military aircraft. So they're the ones who actually die and kill there on the ground, right? And so this is one other interest that has sort of helped develop these also personal relationships with al-Burhan and Hamidti through the Yemen conflict. So this is another factor. Haftar is very much in Libya, is very much an ally of the RSF. They mutually help each other in different ways. And very important also the Wagner Group, which is especially active on the border with the Central African Republic, which we have a border with in the west of Sudan. The Wagner Group and, you know, Russia by extension, or the Russian regime by extension, has helped since the beginning of the war with particularly things like surveillance technology. So it's not in its interest as well for the RSF to be defeated. Russia, Turkey, and other countries are interested in having particularly a base and have bidded for having a base on Sudan's Red Sea because it's a very strategic area. So this is something that governments have been discussing, from al-Bashir to the transitional government and so forth. So Russia is interested to have an actual base there, as are several other countries. So this is just a cross-section of, in terms of the European Union, that's also been a player because of the Khartoum process since 2015, which basically allowed or made the EU have a framework for cooperating with the military regime in Sudan on the question of, well, they say they're fighting human trafficking, but it's actually a system that is meant to stop refugees from crossing into Libya and then crossing the Mediterranean and reaching Europe. And this, of course, is not through direct money transfers, but it is definitely part of the environment that has allowed the RSF, as the primary border guards, as well as human traffickers, they play both sides, on the borders to really grow and prosper. And you see this in the RSF's media. I mean, since the coup, they have also produced a lot of media in European languages, speaking to Europeans, saying, we are your protection from the Sudanese as well as the Ethiopians and the Eritreans and the others. Sudan is a big host of refugees in the region from coming over, so you should support us.
What about the Americans?
The Americans are very interesting. So the Americans were heavily involved, particularly during the years of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which led eventually to the independence of South Sudan. They are, of course, one of the primary lens with which they look at the region is through the war on terror lens. So the Americans are very much not, of course, against Russia getting a foothold in that region. So this is one of the things they're concerned with. They're also concerned with the return to the 1990s when al-Bashir hosted Osama bin Laden and many other internationally wanted people and terrorists. And so they see that an instability in Sudan could open the door for this kind of framework of it becoming a kind of lawless area where that is against their interests in terms of terrorism. But also the U.S. has an interest in relation to Israel. So the U.S. pushed Sudan very, very strongly during the transitional period to exchange normalization with Israel in exchange for removing Sudan from the sanctions list. So there's multiple agendas that the U.S. has. The U.S. has a mechanism of engagement in Sudan. It's been part of what is called the Troika, which is the government of Norway, the government of the UK, and the government of the U.S. have had this Troika mechanism since essentially more than, I think, a decade and a half now, that engages in Sudan in different ways. However, it has not been willing to really take any active measures, for example, to do individual sanctions on Hemiti or Al-Burhan or any of these entities.
So, coming from Algeria myself, living in Tunisia, so two countries that had the experience of revolution and popular uprising, I always had the sense of a very bizarre attitude of the international community towards these peaceful movements.
Exactly. Yeah.
I can imagine that it's the same in Sudan. What, according to you, what positive role could this international community play in at least the conflict resolution, or maybe supporting the transition in Sudan?
I mean, I see in a way that, as we all know, the phrase international community is very loaded. It often, if you really boil it down, it really boils down to mostly the former colonial countries and the imperialist countries who have a lot of power and say, also in the international organizations, who have the kind of leverage that they can intervene and can actually affect change. So this change is often very negative for us in many ways, which I don't think we can get into, but I think a lot of the listeners are aware of. In the case of Sudan, I think the international community has been very invested in Sudan since the uprising. But it's been invested in particularly coming up with power sharing agreements between the military and the Sudanese civil forces. And the reason that they are invested in this, in my opinion, and this is my personal analysis of the situation, is that it looks at the region, including Sudan, through the lens of stability. So it has unfortunately been thinking of stability as more important than the demands of the actual revolution. The demands of the revolutions, first amongst them is justice, second amongst them is freedom, and third amongst them is peace. And they're all equally important and interconnected towards each other. Within the civilian forces, there hasn't been any effort to really distinguish between them. So very early on in the uprising, the Forces for Freedom and Change, which was a coalition that was founded of opposition civilian political parties, as well as some of the unions, as well as some of the civic organizations and NGOs that came together and made a declaration that had a kind of vision of what should happen. Eventually, they went ahead and made the constitutional declaration that happened in August. And the constitutional declaration, which was mediated by the African Union with the help of regional organizations, but also with the backing of the international community, unfortunately, it made a very big mistake. And this was pointed out very much within Sudan, but not listened to. One of the mistakes that it made was that it didn't have any clear mechanisms of this transfer of power. So the idea was that you would have this kind of power sharing situation, but that eventually the military would kind of fade away and be reformed. But then it put the military in charge of its own reform, which just makes no sense. It also, for the first time in our history, it institutionalized within the constitutional document a kind of parallel military. So for the first time, instead of referring to the Sudanese armed forces, we had a reference to the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. And so it built into the agreement itself the RSF as a parallel military, force within the country. This kind of attitude again continued following the October 2021 coup with the negotiations that happened, which had been taken over by the UN at the time. And continuously, the actual grassroots revolutionary bodies like the resistance committees, like the Alliance of Demand-Based Organizations, the groups that are the closest to the communities and that have been working for a very long time to really not just support these communities, but also to come up with an alternative vision, they were not listened to and excluded. So I start with the negative and then maybe I can go to what can actually be done. What is very important to know about the Sudanese uprising is that though it has not managed to defeat the military and to achieve the fully civilian state, which has been the demand from day one, it has also not been defeated. It has continued in multiple forms. And one of the ways in which it has continued is sort of this expansion and explosion of networks and bodies at the level of the neighborhoods that are coordinating with each other, mainly through the resistance committees. There's again no specific number for them, but they're in the thousands now in the country. And they are kind of the ones that have been carrying the resistance forward, but also within them they include things like services committees. So the resistance committees have been largely excluded from the negotiations, but also have refused to engage in the negotiations along the terms that the international community has made, for example, with a lack of transparency behind closed doors and so forth. And so what I think the lesson is that a lot of what the resistance committees and the other civic and revolutionary bodies have been warning about for this whole period has come to light, which is that you cannot put all your efforts into placating the military and the RSF and really not actually listen to what the people in Sudan have been demanding and what they have been asking for. And that the more that you actually placate and put these entities at the center, the more likely it is that we will move further away from the democratic path rather than towards it. And so at the moment, I think what the international community should do is, I personally don't think that there is a solution to this conflict without some level of mediation. We've had several ceasefires since April 15th that have mostly failed. Right now, look who the mediators are. I mean, one of the main mediators is Saudi Arabia, which is very much, involved in what's actually happening and very much supported at the beginning the al-Bashir regime and continues to support a kind of military control of the country, but does carry a lot of leverage with both sides. So they and the US are one mediation process that resulted in this Jeddah agreement. So far, from my conversations over the last days, people are not feeling any effect whatsoever of this agreement, which is supposed to allow for safe routes for civilians to flee, for humanitarian corridors, and so forth. The government of South Sudan, Salva Kiir, the president of South Sudan, has also offered to mediate and has done in the past few years. But again, we're talking about a horrific military regime in South Sudan that has also caused an immense amount of misery there. So the regional organizations have so far not, like the African Union and the IGAD, have tried but have not really been able to get a foothold. And also, unfortunately, they haven't been effective over the last years. This is partly because they still lack a lot of resources, and also because if you look at, for example, the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, it's composed of a lot of these same countries that don't have a vested interest, actually, in Sudan not reaching this point of a democratic transition, because it would threaten their own countries. So I think we really have to, first of all, find a way to pressure the two parties. I mean, we've heard so much about, since the coup of October 2021, of the fact that countries are very concerned. We express deep concerns, but we haven't actually seen any concrete measures, for example, to stop the flow of weapons into the country. Give you an example from the European Union. We found out after the war started recently that the government of Greece has a contract with the Sudanese military to sell the Israeli Predator surveillance system and this is an EU country, right? So you can't even get control of your own member states in terms of the transfers of weapons. The flows of money, the RSF depends very much on gold mining, the smuggling of gold into the international market, mainly via the Emirates. We haven't seen any attempt to actually control that. We also haven't seen any attempt, this has been floated in the US, to have individual sanctions on not just Hemedti and Burhan. The Bashir regime, which is backed by the Islamist movement in Sudan, this is the base of it. They are fighting. We call them militiat al-zil, the shadow militias, are part of this fight and actually are a big part of instigating this fight between the two entities. They are represented in the military very much, and they are also represented in the RSF. We haven't seen any attempts to look at their networks of financing, for example. So I think these are very, it's not about statements. I think we have to mediate a solution. But if you don't turn off the flow of weapons, the smuggling of gold, the flow of finances in and out, you can't be successful, and we've been saying this for years. I think the other thing is humanitarian support. I mean, right now, the international community has been extremely slow in responding to the humanitarian disaster in Sudan. There's close to 1.1 million people displaced, and this is by the UN's own estimates. The infrastructure is collapsed, and who is responding on the ground? It's not the international community. It's mainly the resistance committees and other civic bodies and the unions, especially the preliminary committee for the Sudan Doctors Syndicate. They're the ones who have started these what we call emergency response rooms all over the country. They are the ones dealing with the food insecurity. They are the ones helping people flee. They are the ones treating the people that are injured, and there are many. They're the ones dealing with the interruption of medicines. And so they need support, but the international community has a very rigid idea of how it can support. It relies on the same governments often that are the ones causing the misery, relying on these channels, relying on a ministry of health that actually, unfortunately, the military hasn't been able to form really a proper government in a country that was already one of the poorest in the world. So the humanitarian response, I would say, is the most urgent, but it has to be in a political context of all these other things I spoke of. I think in terms of the left and I would say revolutionary movements elsewhere, we need to keep the spotlight on Sudan. We need to network as much as possible with each other because we share a lot of the same problems. And we also really and very much need to support organizations and bodies and networks like the resistance committees, like the Alliance of Demand-Based Organizations, which is a network of groups that are fighting across the country and for years from prior to the revolution, an alliance of groups that are fighting land grabbing, dam building, privatization of the ports, the predatory mining, which is a massive problem both for the environment and for humans in Sudan. So these are the groups that should be supported, and they're the ones that get the least support.
So what do you, if nothing is done by the international community, how do you see the events going? Do you expect a partition of the country, or do you expect an aggravation of the situation?
This is a very important question. I mean, so if you look, for example, at the resistance committees, they've taken a position that I don't see reflected in mainstream media at all towards this war. And their position has been consistent from day one. They reject both the military and the RSF. So you see a polarization, of course, as what happens in any war situation, with some people feeling that the RSF is going to be the entity that removes the military once and for all, and that we can deal with them easier, so kind of backing the RSF. And you have others, many others, that are backing the Sudan armed forces because they say, yes, we know it belongs to the Kazan, to the members of the Bashir regime, but it can be reformed. The RSF is also not making any friends, especially in places like Khartoum, because it's already known as a monster in Darfur. And Darfurians have a long history of horrific violence by this militia, but also they are, home invasions. They are taking over people's homes and so forth in Khartoum. So some people see the military as a temporary savior and kind of feeling that they could pick up and resume the struggle. The coordination bodies of the resistance committees of Khartoum, along with all the other resistance committees, have been very clear from the outset. We are not backing either of the two parties. We are going to invest in our own revolutionary structures to deal with the humanitarian situation, but to continue the processes of building an alternative to them. And you see them seizing power on the ground in some places. Like you see them now. Already this was starting to happen in the month prior to the war because of the economic crisis. They are doing things from coordinating food and markets to running the hospitals to doing all this through volunteer labor, right? So I say this, but I also don't want to overestimate the coping mechanism of the revolutionary movement. I mean, wars can bury it, right? So I see that it's really, there's several components that have to come together to get us out of this deep crisis. One of them is for the resistance committees and the other revolutionary bars to continue doing what they are doing. Of course, they are facing massive challenges, including displacement of their own members, to continue this work and to be supported to do this work. And the other aspect of it is the mediation. And the third aspect of it is that there have to be some practical measures made to interrupt the flows of money and weapons and support, right? If this doesn't happen, if these things don't come together, I can't even describe, I think, what nightmare it could be. If you look at the wars in the region, it's very rare that you would have this level of large-scale war, including in the capital city. This is one of the most densely populated capital cities in the region, in the whole continent, actually. And this situation can end up with either a proliferation of militias involvement, because there's a lot of arms within the country. So instead of you dealing with 2 or 3 or 4 different entities, you're now dealing with 30, 80, 100. This makes the situation much more complex. So the longer that we wait to tackle it, the harder it will be to tackle.
The Lebanization of the
That's it. I mean, you will have we already have so many. I mean, we're lucky so far that some of the other militias have chosen to retreat and watch and not back. For example, Minawi's militias is one of the ones that have not involved itself in the conflict directly, has not taken a side. It's taking a watch and see approach. You also have a situation where there'll be a polarization with different tribes taking up arms on behalf of one or the other as a way of kind of defending themselves and also kind of safeguarding their own interests, right? And the regime has been, or the counter-revolution has been fomenting ethnic tensions for the last 4 years. This is beyond all the fears, of course, of the Europeans that there will be refugees flowing across the borders. I mean, of course, you have 1.1 million people displaced in 1 month. So what do you expect will happen, right? And so I think it's really a situation that is kind of beyond imagination at this point. And I think the Sudanese people deserve better from the international community. I think they deserve better in general, also from the left, from the civic bodies of the left globally. I think we need more solidarity. And I think we need for them to understand two things: that this situation is not only urgent, but also that this situation is one where there are a lot of resources already to build and work with, and we should recognize them and use them and support them.
So what's the solution from the side of the civil society, from the side of the activists in Sudan, in order to get the train back into his tracks?
I think that there's a recognition. If I think of all the conversations that I've had over the last month, they've been difficult because, of course, people are losing electricity, they're losing networks, phone networks, but the conversation happens in and out, day by day. There is a lot of focus right now by the activists, by the unions, by the resistance committees on dealing with the humanitarian disaster that they're facing. Humanitarian disaster that's not just about the injuries, but also people who get kidney dialysis, who have no access to it, the incredible number of diabetics who have no access to insulin, dealing with the food insecurity issues, dealing with all of these things. So they are dealing with that, but they recognize that there needs to be a mediation process and there needs to be actual practical leverage made. Not let's bring them around the table and talk to them, but there have to be carrots and sticks to stop this war, and that this has to be done in a way that does not empower the RSF or the military. And I think this is the very critical point, which is not paid a lot of attention to. If the military is victorious right now and comes out, this is a return of the al-Bashir regime in a much more even expanded manner, right? So whatever we do has to be done in such a way that it actually keeps the military contained rather than allows the military to expand, right? And then the other thing is the militia is, I say militia, it's actually a lot of militias sort of loosely under the command of this family of Hemeti and the Dagalus in general. And I think with this militia, maybe in my mind, it's a little bit easier because their sources of funding are even more clear. And there's also, it's very hard to find people in Sudan, there are those, but that would disagree that this militia needs to be dissolved, right? The military is more complex because the military is a national institution, even though, of course, it hasn't been for a very long time. But people recognize that the country cannot function without a military. The question is what form of military, right? So whatever negotiations are done and mediation is done, it has to be done in a way that actually, for example, doesn't allow the military to do what it has allowed it to do over the last 4 years, to be in control of its own reform processes. And this is, I think, a combination of both incentives as well as punitive measures that make it clear that you will not be able to survive and continue to do this. This involves getting control of the allies of this military and this RSF. I mean, all the countries that support them are client states themselves of the West. Egypt is heavily dependent on U.S. aid, for example, including military aid. Saudi Arabia is a very close ally of the U.S., right? The Emirates, they're all somehow within the orbit of this international community. And so it is possible to exert leverage on them, to make sure that they at least withdraw their support. And that would be a massive source of pressure for these entities to actually negotiate in good faith. There are other issues. They're very afraid, I think, Al-Burhan and Hemeti, of the al-Bashir scenario. Al-Bashir is wanted, indicted by the ICC, the International Criminal Court. So this is a more complex issue that I would leave for the lawyers, but I think there's war crimes being committed that have been committed prior to this war. And I think, definitely the people in Sudan will not let go of this demand for justice for the crimes that have happened and that continue to happen. I think all of these are moving pieces, but I don't see the will right now. I've had also conversations with members of different bodies, humanitarian sections and political sections of different organizations. They're treating it like somehow, it's an emergency, but it's just another day in Sudan. I don't think there's a real understanding of the gravity of the situation and the implications that it can have. And I think that there has to be the will to do that, but for the will to be there has to be more pressure from civil society and for the media on the politicians, on the international organizations in order to also act.
Is there a unified body that could take this opportunity to emerge?
I think this is the difficulty. I think the FFC, unfortunately, the Forces for Freedom of Change, which is where the international community has put all their baskets in the last 4 years, even as the FFC has lost more and more credibility on the streets. The FFC, unfortunately, seems to be taking the position of kind of hoping, backing in one way or another the RSF to win over the military, with the idea that should they do that, they will allow a democratic transition, because Hemeti has been saying, I'm on the side of the people, I could have supported al-Bashir, but I abandoned him, and so forth. So I don't have a full trust, but I think there could be, there is, for example, a declaration that was signed that brought together, that was signed against the war, that was brought together, it started with the resistance committees of Haj Yusuf, this area in Khartoum, and then it went on. The FFC is a part of it, the Sudanese Professionals Association is part of it, the resistance committees are a part of it. I think it has the nucleus of a body that can do this, right? But I think for this to happen, there already has to be better and stronger support, because right now the same people we're talking about are fleeing. Some of them are fleeing. Some of them are leaving the city. My own family, I mentioned to you, most of my family, almost all my family has been displaced in the last month. So I think there's regrouping happening, and there's a focus on the humanitarian. But I think the structures already exist. And for me, I would look towards, more than anything, I would look towards the resistance committees, some of the unions, some of the professional unions especially, as well as some elements of the FFC, which are already in dialogue together about how to deal with this crisis. It exists if someone's looking for it.
So to summarize, an emergency humanitarian response is needed, a mediation including also the democratic forces should be attempted at least, but with enough guarantees and enough pressure to make them successful.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Sarah,
Thanks
for this very fruitful intervention, and we hope the best for Sudan.
Thank you so much, Akram.